Greeting YouTube. Today we're taking a look at By the Sword, a history of gladiators, musketeers, samurai, swashbucklers, and Olympic champions with a new afterword by the author Richard Cohen. From the cover, you can see that a modern fencer is shown, though actually it's not modern, or is that 19th century? Regardless, but it's a fencer shown in the front. Um, my interest in swords and weapons in general go way back. And it is from both the technical standpoint, the evolution of the items themselves, how they fit into different cultures, because pretty much every culture on the planet used some kind of sword-like object at some point, even if they weren't necessarily made of metal. For example, some of the Polynesian cultures made weapons that had blades and edges out of shark's teeth in some places, and had used edges that were made out of obsidian. Um, and I've even seen ones that were made out of credible blades that were made out of wood. But also the history of how they were used in combat, both in the real world and like in actual, battlefields, as well as in dueling, both at the time when dueling was part of a culture and it was often done to maiming or death, and then eventually to the evolution of the modern fencing, which kind of grew out of dueling. There was a lot of overlap in there. There were times where dueling and fencing were going on simultaneously, and it's important to remember there were lethal duels into the 20th century. So it is not something that was necessarily the bygone era. No. It's not that long ago. And this is a hefty book, and it actually took me quite a while to get through it because it is a dense book. The author covers a lot of ground. He talks about a lot of interesting people. And the author himself is a fencer. In fact, he was personally involved in like national and European level of competitions. So his understanding of fencing is very much from a first-person perspective, and he does devote a lot of this book to fencing. So if you have an interest in some of the things I mentioned, the technical evolution of them, the societal place that swords played, and how they were used on battlefields, that is not the entirety of this book. At least half or more of this book is fencing. And a lot of the folks that were involved in it over the course of the entire history of the sport, all the way up to the most modern times when this thing was published. And it kind of amazed me that I think I just never really thought about it, because to me, fencing is something that is, pardon me, hey, that's a spammer. All right, fencing is definitely something that I've always thought of as being for the wealthy. It isn't, because you can get involved in it at a lower price point, and there are clubs out there that will help folks. And in fact, there have even been famous folks that created clubs that were funded both by themselves and from donors and such to help cover the costs, so they could fuel the sport with new blood. Some of those people became dictatorial, maniacal authoritarians in a very bad way, but sometimes it was just because they wanted to see their sport flourish. They wanted to make sure that the art of making the things that were used in this sport don't die out, because there's making fencing costumes and masks and safety gear and the foils themselves and the epées and the sabers is not a common practice. And those are the three branches of fencing that you see in the world today: the epée, the foil, and the saber. The author himself, I believe his favorite was the saber. And the level of corruption is somewhat astounding. And a lot of it was very open. It was just like quid pro quo, like, we'll score this match really well today if you'll score that match really well tomorrow. And a lot of the times the people that would find themselves judging events were themselves involved in the sport. And wouldn't that be viewed as like a conflict of interest by most folks? And yet it just seems to be kind of, we're just not going to pay attention to that. And of course, governments have used their teams as bargaining chips when it came to international politics, particularly during the Cold War. Um, and there were a number of very interesting people that the author covers who would make fascinating character studies for books in their own right, and they may exist already, but also in films, and I don't know of them having ever had films based around them. And I apologize, I'm not going to give you the names because I am horrible at names, remembering names at best. And I finished this book quite a while ago, and thanks to depression, I did not get around to reviewing it until quite recently, like today, which is March 14th. It's not, is that officially the Ides of March? It's the Ides of March, day dedicated to bladed weapons, but just in a much different way. Um, so if you like fencing, this is a book you're going to have to read. If you like swords and how they fit into cultures and societies and how they were used in dueling, which eventually became fencing, this is your thing. But if you're really just involved in the earlier aspects of sword use, this may not be your cup of tea. If you don't want to read a lot about a whole history of fencing with a lot of names coming at you, men and women and trainers and rich people and scandals and government involvements and cheating and, corruption, that may not be something that you really want to get into. So this is a book that it it had more fencing than I wanted, but I understood the context from which it was coming from, both the author's personal history and that in the modern era, that is the sword. So if you're going to write a book about the sword, you kind of have to cover fencing. Maybe not quite to the depth the author did, but you still have to cover fencing. He covers a lot of it. So this could be a book that you've been waiting for your entire life. It could be a book that might be vaguely intriguing to you, and it could be one that you can say, while I'm interested in one of those things, I'm not interested in all of them, so you may want to pass. I actually was going to pass this book on to a coworker of mine, or a former coworker of mine, because he's heavily into military history and things like that. And I thought he would just eat this up. I mean, he's the kind of guy that will sit around and read, Roman treaties by emperors for, entertainment. Not that I haven't done that as well, but there aren't a lot of us, so I thought he would appreciate this. And then one day he just stopped coming to work. I think it may have been COVID related, but he just never came back. So he's gone now, so I can't pass this on to him. So I'll just be donating this to a thrift shop, which is where I got it. I got this at a thrift shop myself, so I've lucked into it. I had heard of it before, so it was kind of, back in my brain, a little tickle. I'd heard this book existed. Then I stumbled upon a copy, and I'm like, hey, buy the sword. I think I've heard of this. Then I read the blurb, and I'm like, hey, this is definitely that I want to read. And I did, and I enjoyed it, even if it was a bit of a slog at spots. Like I said, if you are heavily into fencing, this is your book. But if you are not heavily into fencing, you may want to think about this for a hot minute.